4th of September 1962. In an extraordinary demonstration of affection, 250,000 Glaswegians lined the streets of the city to pay homage to their trams, which had served them faithfully for 90 years. They gathered to watch a procession of 20 cars travel from Dalmarnock Depot in the East End to Copler Hill Works. Included were representatives from different epochs. Company-owned horse trams, which had first appeared in 1872, came under municipal control in 1894. This was one of 385 horse cars operated by the Corporation Tramways Department. The first electric tram route, opened in October 1898, had been worked by 21 centre-entrance single-deckers, known locally as room and kitchen or button Ben cars. Over 1,000 four-wheel double-deckers were built between 1898 and 1924. 2 featured in the procession. Both have been restored to represent a different phase in the development of the Glasgow standard. Built in 1926, 1089 was an experimental high-speed single-decker designed to compete on long-distance routes. Several of the highly regarded coronations ran, including 1173, restored to 1938 condition. 1274 is now housed in a museum in the United States. Also well represented were the post-war coronations, the last of which had entered service in 1952. But for almost 60 years, it was the seemingly indestructible standards which dominated the giant 135-mile network, of which a third lay outside the city boundary. The tram services radiated out through a bewildering variety of landscapes, ranging from shop and tenement-lined inner-city streets to narrow country lanes, often in the case of a single journey. Abandonment of uneconomic lines in favour of motor buses began as early as 1925, but the last major extension was not opened until 1949. In the same year, trolleybuses were introduced, replacing trams between Provan Mill and Polmadee. This was an experimental high-capacity standee window single-decker. The initial fleet of 70-seater double-deckers were replicas of designs already operating in Newcastle and London. Despite some scrappings, 876 standards were in stock when these views were taken in June 1951, and a few still carried coloured route bands. 486 in Cowcaddens is showing the old red code. However, withdrawals were now intensifying. 698, a round dash veteran of 1899, was scrapped in 1952. 742, built a year later, survived until 1955. It is seen on the Sinclair Drive service, finally withdrawn in December 1951. 1000 of 1901 was another early withdrawal, being scrapped in 1953. 296 in St Vincent Place, shortly before the 24 resumed its original routing over Jamaica Bridge. Bound for Rutherglen on a former white service, Hex-174 of 1913 was scrapped in 1958. 1143 entered service on the 19th of November 1937 and was the first of the production line of 150 coronations. 1361 survived until the end of the system and was one of the 100 Cunadas constructed between 1948 and 1952. In 1955, Glasgow was Scotland's foremost port, as well as a major industrial and manufacturing centre. Thousands of workers were employed in factories, shipyards and engineering firms, as well as in the miles of docks. Several ferries still plied for trade across the Clyde. 1,000 trams were needed to handle the huge peak hour surges in traffic. By 1955, some 680 standards remained as the backbone of the fleet. Although found on all services, they were, however, proving increasingly costly to maintain, especially as revenue from fares was no longer matching expenditure. The fleet was partially replenished with the purchase of 46 78-seater streamline cars from Liverpool in 1953-4, but these proved less than successful and were limited initially to service 29. The double bogie standards were limited to 2 services, the 9 and 26. The modern bogie cars were to be found on most routes. Although due mainly to clearance problems, certain services did remain the exclusive preserve of the standards. Faced by mounting economic problems, together with concern over increasing traffic congestion, the corporation decided in 1955 to accept the recommendations of a report calling for the electrification of the extensive suburban rail network, the early elimination of most of the loss-making over-the-boundary tram services, and long-term replacement by buses and trolleybuses of the entire tram system. To release 300 life-expired standards for scrap, 10 tram services were to be replaced as soon as possible. The full story of the growth of the undertaking and the closures of 1956 to 59 is told in the highly acclaimed companion video, Glasgow Trams Part 1, which includes a wealth of excellent archive footage. This tape, whilst concentrating upon the closures of 1960 to 62, begins with a brief look at the range of services either discontinued or replaced between 1956 and 1959. The over-the-boundary closure policy began in September 1956, when the countrified outer portion of Service 14, linking Crossstobbs and Arden, was discontinued without direct replacement. Of special historical significance was the closure in November 1956 of the 6 miles from Baillieston to Airdrie, which included a 2¼ mile stretch of high-speed roadside reservation built in 1923 to link the Glasgow system to the formerly independent and unconnected Airdrie and Cope Bridge line, taken over by Glasgow in 1921. In May 1957, the bulk of the former Paisley system, taken over by Glasgow in 1923, was abandoned. This included Service 21, which operated from Glasgow to Elderslie. In the centre of Paisley, the 21 crossed the Gold Mine, the highly profitable 5¼ mile local service 28, which had been modernised and upgraded in 1949. It operated from Glenfield to Renfrew Ferry. Each abandonment released more standards for scrap, those in better condition being transferred for work elsewhere. Full-scale erosion of services operating into suburbs south of the Clyde began with replacement of the 5, 5A and 24 in late 1957 and early 1958. Withdrawal of the Cross-City 27 marked the beginning of closure of those services penetrating not only into the densely populated northern industrial suburbs, but also of the network of lines operating in and around Govan Docks. As far as the remaining classes of car were concerned, the 5 experimental lightweights were the first complete casualties. Being non-standard, all had been officially withdrawn when in Easter 1958, 1001 operated on an enthusiast tour, concentrating primarily on those services scheduled to close during 1958. The first to go in June was the circuitous former Yellow Peril Service 7, which operated from Milliston to Bellahouston. In its perambulations, it crossed or connected with many other Glasgow services. It was replaced by double-decker trolleybuses in June 1958. Notices advertising each abandonment were posted in the cars. Inbound from the city boundary at Hillington Road on the wide expanse of Renfrew Road. From Shield Hall and through Govan, the tracks were shared with P-car specials on the 12. Interestingly, these journeys survived the closure of the 4 by 2 months. On their 2.5-mile journey, the 12 shugled along Cathcart Road on some of the worst track on the system. Other features included a grade of 1 in 12 on Shields Road. Power drawn from wires supported by elegant Edwardian centre poles, and a series of tightly angled bends near Paisley Road Toll. This was the last tram-to-trolleybus conversion in November 1958 and introduced 10 of these long single-deckers. Replaced at the same time were the 22 and 32, as a result of which trams ceased to operate north-south over the busy intersection on the west side of Central Station. And they no longer crested King George V Bridge, or ran along Commerce Street. These were the last 2 services operating through Paisley Road Toll to the city boundary at Crookston. With replacement of the 8 in March 1959, trams no longer climbed out over the Monkland Canal Bridge to Millerston. In the south, the 8 was the first of the lines serving the middle-class suburbs of Giffnock and Rook and Glen to go over to buses. In June, with replacement of the 25, trams disappeared from Rook and Glen Road, as well as from the short extension to Carnwadrick, opened in 1948. On the opposite side of the city, the 25 climbed north from Springburn, crossing the city boundary to terminate at Bishop Briggs, tracks it had shared with the 32 until November 1958. November 1959 saw replacement of services 6 and 14. At Lauder's Corner, the 6 headed east towards Town Head and Parliamentary Road. In P-cars, some continued as far as Ridley. The 14s were now the last trams operating south from Shawlands through Thornley Bank, with its pleasant tree-lined roads. The outer end of the 14 from Spears Bridge was on reserved track. Historically, the last half-mile of this roadside light railway had previously been owned by the Paisley District Tramways. Since September 1956, the 14s have been curtailed at Arden. With replacement of the 31 in December 1959, trams no longer operated south of Eglinton Toll, except for journeys to Newlands Depot. This was a year of major change. The tramway abandonment programme was entering its final stages, with the end now expected in the autumn of 1962. At the beginning of 1960, the trams were responsible for carrying about 140 million passengers a year on approximately 90 route miles. There were still 12 services operating from 6 depots. Out of a mixed fleet of some 400 vehicles, approximately 100 veteran standards remained. Dating variously from 1900 to 1924, they operated regularly throughout the system, but were the only class permitted to work round certain curves at Park Head. The 1 and 30 became the last services in Glasgow worked almost exclusively by traditional 4-wheel double-deckers. Despite decreased maintenance allied to the threat of withdrawal, the standards had proved as reliable as ever in coping with severe weather conditions at the start of 1960. By now, some of the standards had received external body bracing. Inroads had been made into the modern cars as well. Those withdrawn included 1142, the prototype Coronation. The remaining ex-Liverpool Goddesses were also facing imminent extinction. 46 of these streamliners had been purchased in 1953-4. 2 foot longer than the Coronations, they encountered clearance problems, which initially limited their use to Service 29, which from November 1956 had operated from Mary Hill to Broomhouse. St George's Cross. Hope Street. From May 1957, the Goddesses were also allocated to Service 15. Due to water ingress, some cars had lost the distinctive curved glass in the lower deck windscreen. During their relatively short stay in the city, the Goddesses underwent other minor structural alterations. Both the 15 and the 29 headed east along Gallowgate to Parkhead Cross, where the lines diverged. Movements through this complex junction being controlled by a pointsman situated in the brick-built signal tower in the background. Parkhead Depot. The Goddesses did not prove popular in Glasgow. The drivers complained of water seepage, the conductors grumbled about the narrow aisles, and the cost of rectifying faults at Copler Hill led to their early demise. Latterly, most looked decidedly shabby. Broomhouse, eastern extremity of the 29. These views on the outer countrified section between Shettleston and Baillieston were taken in 1959, when the class was still very much in evidence. Away from the confines of the city, they were capable of a fast turn of speed. Garrow Hill. Baillieston Terminus. In sub-zero temperatures, one of the surviving 7 goddesses toured the system on the 21st of February 1960. At Newlands, 825 is attached to a salt trailer. Reviving memories of Liverpool's miles of reserve track, 1055 speeds along Moss Park Boulevard. Further unfamiliar territory for this class of car. Trundling down Peyton Street towards Denniston Depot. Note the parked trolleybus in the background. Here it cautiously negotiates the tightly angled Finniston loop. Eventually purchased for preservation, the car is now fully restored as Liverpool 869 and can be seen at the National Tramway Museum at Cryche in Derbyshire. On the 12th of March, services 1 and 30 were withdrawn, only the former being replaced by buses. Starting in the East End, the 1 and 30 provided a joint service to Annisland, where the 30 continued to Blair Dardy, with the 1 diverging to Scotstoun West. In peak hours, when 45 cars were required, shipyard extras are continued as far as Dalmuir West until September 1959, and subsequently to Dalmuir only, making this the city's longest remaining service. At the southern end of Kingsway, a shipyard special turns onto Dumbarton Road. The off-peak terminus was at the foot of Kingsway. The 8-mile cross-city journey from Scotstoun West to Springfield Road took 52 minutes. Scotstoun Hill Railway Bridge linked Kingsway with Annisland Road. Built to serve interwar housing, the line from Annisland to Scotstoun West was opened in 2 stages during the 1920s. Southbrae Drive. Munro Place. Connection with Companion Service 30 was made at Annisland Cross. The city's last major tramway extension was the half-mile of reserve track along Great Western Road to Blair Dardy, opened on the 31st of July 1949. A further extension westwards to Duntocka was authorised, but never built due to the presence of the canal bridge. From 1928, the terminus had been here at Knightswood Cross. Reflecting similar tramway construction in Birmingham, Leeds and Liverpool, this stretch of central carriageway reservation never benefited from the regular operation of modern bogie cars. Now grassed over, this section could today still form part of a modern light rail line. Back at Annisland Cross Junction. From the station, a half-mile length of paved reservation led past the Gaumont, formerly the Ascot Cinema. Then underdeveloped land. And Bingham's Pond, before entering the well-to-do West End suburbs of Kelvinside and Hill Head. The junction with Service 10 at Heinlein Road. At the Botanic Gardens, an inbound 10 passes a westbound 30 outside the ornate station building closed to passengers in 1939. Two spires dominated the inner portion of Great Western Road, those of Lansdowne Church and St Mary's Cathedral. A coronation on Service 10 turns out of Park Road. The west side of the five-way junction at St George's Cross now fell into disuse. In the hilly area between New City Road and Sauchiehall Street, the two services followed the route of the first horse-car line up Cambridge Street. The junction with Sauchiehall Street. At the Renfield Street St Vincent Street corner, both services turn left towards George Square by way of St Vincent Place. George Square, the commercial heart of the city, was flanked on the northwest side by the magnificent arch of Queen Street Station, now hidden by a hotel extension. Laid out in 1781, the square was surrounded by elegant civic and public buildings. The neat lawns and flower beds were interspersed with 13 statues erected in memory of deceased dignitaries. The tramway heading east towards Denniston had started with company horse cars in 1873. The trams crossed the High Street trolleybus routes at the intersection with Duke Street, and then past a former women's prison. Between St George's Cross and Shettleston Road, Park Head, the two services were duplicated by the 23. At Denniston, trams and trolleybuses had coexisted since replacement of the Yellow Peril in 1958. Note the complex of overhead tram and trolleybus wiring, including access for Denniston Depot. The car in the background is turning towards the depot, one of only two on the system to house trams and trolleybuses. A 30 passes Duke Street Station. Short working cars displaying Denniston actually reversed in Carntine Road siding. A 30 rumbles under the twin bridges spanning Duke Street. The Shettleston Road junction with Service 23 was overshadowed by William Beardmore's Parkhead Forge. Approaching the Granada Cinema at the Parkhead end of Duke Street. The use of bogie cars was prohibited on these northern curves at Parkhead Cross. At this busy junction, the standards whipped round one curve and then immediately bit into another of even greater severity. This disabled standard is being towed back to Dalmarnock Depot. The Diamond Crossing with London Road. Springfield Road would remain for depot access to Dalmarnock until March 1962. At Dalmarnock Road, the 30s turned southeast to reverse just short of Dalmarnock Bridge. 8¼ miles and 55 minutes from Blair Dardy. Returning from Dalmarnock, the motorman of car 145 changes the points at the foot of Springfield Road. A 1 waits to use the terminal crossover. Opened in 1922 to replace White Vale, Parkhead was the city's most modern depot, with a maximum capacity for 80 cars. These views were taken in 1959. Latterly, it was also unique in having Britain's only tram washing plant installed in September 1954, complete with upright rotating brushes. It was the corporation's first motorbus garage and is still in use. The cleanest and best kept cars were associated with the former White Service 3, which due to reconstruction of Maxwell Road Railway Bridge was replaced by Bus 59 as from the 5th of June 1960. At the same time, the 23 was rerouted in the city and the 10 London Road to Kelvinside withdrawn without replacement. Reflecting the districts it served, the 3 was nicknamed the Route of the High and Mighty. It had always enjoyed a high percentage of modern cars, but standards from Newlands had still been used in 1959. As the system contracted, so those four-wheelers in the best condition were transferred to other depots. Here a former Elderslie car, 77, is seen at Albert Cross. Deteriorating track could mean a less than comfortable ride. The reserve track on Moss Park Boulevard, the first built by the corporation, opened in 1923 to serve a new housing scheme. In this 1959 view, Works Car 18 was employed on weed-killing operations. 18 had been converted to this form in 1937, using parts of the former water car. Here it uses the original terminal crossover at Moss Park, but in the wrong direction. Unusually, its platforms could be boarded from either side. With the closure of the reserve tracks, number 18 was withdrawn in April 1960. To improve public transport at the time of the 1938 Empire Exhibition held in Bellahouston Park, the reserve track was extended round into Corker Hill Road, where connection was also made with Paisley Road West. Houses have subsequently been built on this site. From Moss Park Terminus, city-bound 3s encountered no fewer than 11 right-angle bends on their 6-mile journey to Park Road. These recordings of cars on the reserve track were made during the final week of operation. Still used in P cars, Dumbreck crossover had also been terminus until 1956 for rush hour journeys on Service 40. On the last day of operation, a post-war coronation turned sharply from Dumbreck Road onto the boulevard, the last stretch of reserve track in Scotland. For the next mile, the threes operated through Dumbreck and Pollock-Shields, classic Victorian suburbs of tree-lined avenues and imposing mansions, some occupied by civic leaders. Nithsdale Road at Sherbrooke St Gilbert's Church. The coronations have particular associations with Service 3, these being the new luxury cars described in publicity brochures for the 1938 Empire exhibition. Residences of former Lord Provosts were distinguished by a pair of ornate lampposts. One of the 6 replacement coronations of 1954 turns into St Andrew's Drive. Another 90-degree bend, this time leading from Albert Drive into St Andrew's Drive. The virtual absence of motor traffic gave the trams a clear run through much of this tranquil backwater. Because the trams had bow collectors, complex arrangements existed at those points where trams and trolleybuses crossed each other, as at Shields Road. Kenmure Street. Before the war, a standard had overturned on this sharp bend. The forthcoming closure of Maxwell Road railway bridge in connection with electrification forced the corporation to replace the 3 2 years ahead of schedule. South from Eglinton Toll, 1.5 miles of track was retained for access to Newlands Depot. Pollock-Shaws Road. Cars had to reverse twice to reach this, the city's largest tram depot, but by 1960, a shadow of its former self. Back at Eglinton Toll, service cars turned north along Eglinton Street. Until 1958, this had been the major tramway artery leading to the southwestern suburbs. Cumberland Street Railway Bridge. Following closure of the 3, the track from Eglinton Toll to St Vincent Street via Jamaica Bridge would remain in order to provide access to the works and the permanent way yard. Jamaica Street. Union Street. 287 cars an hour had once used this part of Renfield Street in peak hours, equal to a car every 12.5 seconds. Lauder's Corner. With the loss of the 3 and the diversion of the 23, trams would no longer serve either the main part of the city's principal shopping thoroughfare, Sauchiehall Street, or Cambridge Street, seen in the background. However, for a further 12 months, those services turning in and out of Elm Bank Street would use a short stretch of Sauchiehall Street. Just beyond Charing Cross, the 3s and 10s diverged from St George's Road to run past the small hotels and foreign consulates in Woodlands Road. The tenements in the background were swept away for construction of the Ring Road in 1969. On the final day of operation, standards were still working several duties on the 10. Park Road crossover, 39 minutes from Moss Park. The 10 was the last service travelling along the Great Western Road. Unusually for Glasgow, the road surface between the tracks had been relaid in asphalt. After turning into Heinlein Road, the cars reversed outside the old station, closed later that year. Returning from Kelvinside, eastbound 10s diverged from the 3s at Elm Bank Street. 2 standards and a Cunarder passed the King's Theatre. Car 582 on a short working to Douglas Street was soon back again. Complete with passengers, it pushes a disabled Coronation, also with passengers, back to Mary Hill. The eastern terminus of the 10 was at London Road, 6 miles and 40 minutes from Kelvinside. On the 3, 1397 made the final trip from Park Road to Moss Park, arriving back at Newlands Depot at 12:40 a.m. on the 5th of June. With the departure that afternoon of sister car 1395, the rundown of the city's largest depot was finally complete. After serving as a bus garage until 1986, it is now the site of a superstore. Throughout 1960, redundant cars were broken up at Copler Hill at the rate of 2 to 3 per week. But 1055 escaped the scrapman's torch when on the 8th of June it left Dalmarnock for the works and the journey back south for preservation. The last ex-Liverpool car in service was 1036, probably on Thursday the 26th of May. It was not all scrappings and closures. On the 1st of August, the 600 yards of track between Dalmuir and Dalmuir West was reactivated following the recommissioning of the swing bridge over the Forth and Clyde Canal, which had been closed for repairs since September 1959. Appropriately, the first car to rumble across was Kilmarnock bogie 1092. This class was so named after the Kilmarnock Engineering Company, who assemble the maximum traction bogies on all but number 1090, the prototype. Built between 1927 and 28, the 46 remaining cars have been confined for many years to services 9 and 26. At speed, they had a tendency to lean at an alarming angle. Also, being prone to derail on sharp points, the 9 and 26 were operationally ideal, both being relatively straight and flat. The only grade of any significance was on the section between Burnside and Rutherglen Main Street. The class had first ventured out to Farm Cross, following withdrawal of the 17 in November 1958. Seating 68, and with unlimited standing downstairs and upstairs at times, the big bogie cars were excellent crowd movers in all types of weather. When first placed in service on the Airdrie-Paisley route in 1928, the Kilmarnocks had an unfortunate tendency to derail on the points which used to link Argyle Street with Jamaica Street. In 1914, this was the busiest tramway junction in the city, with 516 car movements per hour on Saturdays. This view clearly shows the longitudinal seating in the lower saloon, which was fitted during the war. Argyle Street at St Vincent Street. Partick Hill Station with competing modes of transport. Primrose Street, White Inch. 1100 had been rebuilt in 1941 with coronation-style streamline ends. One of the busiest points on the Dumbarton Road was Balmoral Street siding at Scotstoun. It served the nearby labour-intensive shipyards and factories. (1100) operated at peak times only. Another peak time regular was 1089. The Glasgow-Clydebank boundary. Site of the former junction for Duntocka. The 26 terminated at Clydebank. The 9s continued to Dalmuir West. By the end of 1960, only 15 Kilmarnocks remained, and all were gone by August 1961. 1100, however, survived in service until the 1st of November 1961. The 20-seater single-decker 1089 was placed in store following introduction in August 1960 of a 5-only standing rule. From the 6th of November, the 23 was partially replaced by bus route 60. At the same time, Denniston Depot was closed to trams and the loss-making portion of the 29 from Toll Cross to Broom House withdrawn without direct replacement. The only real traffic on the Broom House section was to Calder Park Zoo, opened in 1947. Until 1948, trams had continued beyond Broom House to Uddingston. By mid-1960, 751 was the oldest operational standard, having clocked up 60 years of service. Special workings to and from Anderston Cross were numbered 15. During the summer of 1960, the zoo specials were often worked by Dalmarnock's dwindling allocation of standards. Although seemingly rural in nature, steelworks, coalfields and a sandpit were in close proximity. At Mount Vernon, the cars bucked and swayed on the worn rails, snaking under the railway bridge. This was the site of the junction with the Little Hughes line along the eastern end of London Road, laid as an unemployment relief measure in 1923. At Parkhead, city-bound 29s continued along Gallowgate, the zoo specials for Dalmarnock Depot turning into Springfield Road. The 9-mile 23 duplicated other major services at either end. From the Maryhill Park terminus, it ran in tandem with the 29 on the long descent down Maryhill Road. Although passing Maryhill Depot, most 23s were operated from Denniston and at the end almost exclusively by coronations. 2 Alexander buses labour uphill in the direction of Mulgai. The low arch of the canal bridge forced the bow collectors towards the roof of the car. Glasgow used a shallower collector plate because of the number of low bridges. St George's Cross. Since June, the 23s have been rerouted via Hope Street. Here, emergency repairs are carried out to the city's only three-quarter Grand Union. All the track east from St Vincent Street to Shettleston Sheddings was now due to close. George Square West. George Square North with St George's Tron Church in the background. George Street, and past the Royal Technical College, now Strathclyde University. Having left the architectural splendours of the city centre, the cars plunged into the smoke and grime of the industrial East End. Overshadowed by the nearby Parkhead Forge, the 23s entered Shettleston Road. Here it was said children were taken out not for a walk in the pram, but a cough. The area had been the scene of a fatal tram fire in 1959. Shettleston Sheddings, junction with Service 15. Beyond the city boundary, passengers enjoyed a fast run through the semi-rural community of Garrow Hill before alighting here at Baillieston. Until 1956, trams had continued for another 6 miles to Coatbridge and Airdrie. 4 years later, only a few rusting poles and the abandoned trackbed was still visible. Situated on Peyton Street, Denniston Depot had a maximum capacity for 134 cars, normally standards and coronations. When 1055 visited the depot in February, it only just squeezed through the narrow entrance. After closure, the depot was sold to an adjacent bakery. At the beginning of 1961, approximately 45 route miles remained worked by about 250 cars, operating from 3 depots on 7 services. The few surviving Kilmarnock bogies were still employed solely on the 9 and 26. Despite the spate of abandonments, the city centre portion of Argyle Street was served entirely by trams, and in certain other areas of the city, the trams were as much in evidence as ever. Only a handful of standards remained, plus some demoted to shunters and snowplows. During the year, the corporation intended to replace a further 4 services, including all those in the north of the city. The first to go was the former Green Service 16, operating from Keppock Hill Road in the northeast to Scotstoun in the west. This 5 3/4 mile cross-city line was replaced by Bus 32 on the 12th of March. The day before, the Maryhill White Inch Shipyard Specials were withdrawn. The 16 had been cut back from Springburn Elm Vale Street to the eastern end of Keppock Hill Road in September 1959. An outbound car crosses the bridge spanning the main line from Glasgow Queen Street to Edinburgh Waverley. The cars pass between typical rows of tenements en route to Moss House and the former junction with the services to Saracen Cross. Beyond Moss House, the road dipped beneath the bridge carrying the Forth and Clyde Canal. Two cars swing round the double S-bend at Round Toll. This had formerly been a major tramway intersection. So had St George's Cross, but with replacement of the 16, only 3 sides of the junction would remain operational. The whole complex had been relayed as late as October 1959. Sharing the same tracks as the 18s, the 16s now ran through to Charing Cross. Leaving Sauchiehall Street, the cars turned sharp right into Elm Bank Street, passing the distinctive Beresford Hotel, opened in 1938. At the junction with St Vincent Street, the 16s headed west and away from the city centre. The ring road now crosses at this point. A northbound 16 swings off Argyle Street into St Vincent Street. Westbound, the 16s join the throng of trams travelling towards Partick. The journey time to Scotstoun was 41 minutes. Since the closure of Postle Park, the 16 have been operated from Partick Depot. It was thought this abandonment would mark the end of both the Standards and the Kilmarnocks. However, a totally unexpected disaster prolonged their active life by several months. In the early hours of the 22nd of March 1961, over half of Dalmarnock Depot was ravaged by fire. 50 cars were lost, the majority being Coronations and Cunardas. A couple of scorched cars were eventually retrieved from the tangled wreckage and returned to service. At first it was thought the abandonment programme might be brought forward, but in the event only 15 duties were cancelled. Standards destroyed included 283 and 526, which had been earmarked for preservation. However, with commendable foresight, the corporation pressed 2 other cars set aside for museum purposes back into service, 488 and 1088. This group of Standards and Kilmarnocks, reprieved because of the fire, achieved celebrity status during the next 2.5 months. 1089 also re-entered service on the 23rd of March. Former white services, 18 and 18A, were replaced by buses as from the 4th of June 1961. From Springburn in the north, the 18s operated through the city to Bridgeton Cross. Here they diverged, each crossing the Clyde by different bridges before reversing at separate termini within the Royal Borough of Rutherglen. At the same time, the 26 was cut back to Dalmarnock or Farm Cross. The closure of the 18s completed the rundown of services in Springburn, once the heart of the world's locomotive building industry. This bridge in Hawthorne Street carried the railway tracks leading from Queen Street Station, as well as those serving Cowlairs Works and Eastfield Sheds. Heading towards the Saracen Foundry and the former Postle Park Depot. Having crossed Balmore Road, a city-bound 18A tackles the sharp bend at the start of Billsland Drive. At visiting hours, the cars were packed with people travelling to the nearby Ruckhill Hospital. The Forth and Clyde Canal, opened fully in 1790, proved something of an obstacle for the city's highway engineers. In order to link up with the Mary Hill Road, the trams first passed under the Billsland Drive aqueduct built in 1879, then negotiated 2 right-angle bends, the junction with Mary Hill Road. A mile to the northwest was Mary Hill Depot, which shared operation of the 18 with Dalmarnock. Passing ye old Tramcar Vaults public house. "1163 was one of only 2 cars returned to service after the Dalmarnock fire. The 18s had the dubious distinction of being the last routes to operate in several parts of the West End. Charing Cross. Sauchiehall Street. Elm Bank Street. And finally Bothwell Street, with its motor car showrooms and its contrasting Victorian and American-style architecture. "1213 turns from Hope Street into Bothwell Street. Having paralleled other major routes through the city, the 18s diverged at Bridgeton Cross. The 18A heading directly south down Main Street on the relatively short spur to Shorefield. Interestingly, outbound cars displayed 18A. Those returning from Shorefield were meant to show 18. Rutherglen Bridge, opened in 1896, replaced an earlier structure. On the other side of the river, the cars entered the independent borough of Rutherglen. Here they ran the few hundred yards to and from Shorefield Toll. The exposed terminus was at a spot close to the Greyhound Stadium and Clyde Football Ground, 7 miles and 46 minutes from Springburn. Until 1955, trams had continued along Glasgow Road in the background to Rutherglen Cross. The 18s and 26s reached Rutherglen by way of Dalmarnock Road. On leaving the city tenements and overlooked by Dalmarnock Power Station, the trams swept majestically over Dalmarnock Bridge and on into Rutherglen. The bridge itself dated from 1891, replacing an earlier 18th century original. Tram services in Rutherglen had been owned, interconnected and operated by Glasgow Corporation since their introduction in 1902. Rutherglen Cross. This sedate residential area contrasted sharply with the industrial grime of Springburn. The extension up Stonelaw Road to the Rutherglen boundary at Burnside opened in 1908. An outbound coronation snakes past the junction with the former siding serving the special school in Greystone Avenue. Turning into Duke's Road, site of Burnside Terminus, 8 3/4 miles and 56 minutes from Springburn. An authorised extension to Cathkin Braes Park was never constructed. This time, there was to be no last-minute reprieve for the standards. 1,004 of these remarkable vehicles had entered service between 1898 and 1924. Over the decades, they were rebuilt, modernised, upgraded, and fitted with improved motors and trucks. Some had been scrapped pre-war, but the vast majority were broken up in the 1950s. Latterly, their admired longevity had actually placed considerable strain upon the workshop facilities at Copler Hill, contributing in no small way to the escalating cost of the tram system. Hex-1051 was withdrawn following its last revenue trip on the 2nd of June. (1088) probably last appeared in the evening peak on Monday the 5th of June. This, the last standard to be built in 1924, had been selected for inclusion in the corporation's collection of preserved cars. Round-488 of 1902 had worked the final through journey on the 18 from Springburn to Burnside on the 3rd of June. This car had already been prepared for inclusion in a museum collection in Paris. .585 of 1901 last operated on the 2nd of June, but was held in store at Partick pending preservation. The Kilmarnocks lingered on a little longer. .1106 had been withdrawn on the 3rd of June. But 1133 continued until the 28th, when it failed in service. Shortly before withdrawal, it is seen in the hands of an all-female crew. In 1961, the corporation employed 15 motor women and 202 conductresses. .1115 soldiered on until after the evening peak on the 4th of August. The car was then stored at Partick. .1089, which had last operated in mid-June, was also placed in store again. This left only one truly non-standard tram in service, the hybrid Kilmarnock 1100, which continued making its regular peak hour excursions until the 1st of November. Interestingly, the steam train above had temporarily taken over from the defective electric blue trains, originally introduced in November 1960. By June, only 10 roads at Partick were still functional, lines 11 to 21 having been dewired. Mary Hill had also been partially closed to facilitate conversion into a bus garage, trams being confined to the cramped area of the original depot. With maximum capacity for 93 cars, Mary Hill had primarily housed standards and coronations, and for 7 years the ex-Liverpool goddesses. Latterly, there were 27 coronations plus 1 standard, depot shunter number 22. Last used in service in December 1960, it had been posted as shunter to Mary Hill the following month. 22 was dispatched to Copeland Hill on the 19th of October for rebuilding to its original 1922 condition prior to preservation. Although only the inner portion of the former 12-mile 29 still remained, this surviving section linking Mary Hill in the northwest with Toll Cross in the east still carried extremely heavy traffic. It was replaced by buses on the 22nd of October 1961. From the same date, the Farm Cross Dalmarnock section of the 26 was discontinued without replacement. The cutback of the 26 was historically significant in that it marked the end of tramway operation in Rutherglen and also of regular tramway operation across the Clyde bridges. Latterly, the 29 had a peak hour requirement of some 40 cars. To alleviate bunching, late running and overcrowding, and to operate numerous short workings, frequent intermediate turning points were provided. Here, 1220 makes the equivalent of a 3-point turn outside Mary Hill Depot. Celtic Street was once claimed to be the shortest street in the city. Until 1891, Mary Hill had been a separate borough. This was Mary Hill Cross. The Forth and Clyde Canal again, with the road dipping under another low stone arch. A defective car manoeuvres into Gairbraid Avenue siding on the wrong line. The 29 was the last of the hilly routes. During the 3.5 miles to the city, the cars tackled a number of relatively steep grades. Down past 2 well-known landmarks, the Barracks and Mary Hill Central Station. Vernon Street crossover. An inbound Cunarder takes the curve at Queen's Cross. The Garscube Road section in the background was replaced by trolleybuses in 1953. Only 2 prongs of St George's Cross Junction would now remain in use. However, the cars continued to make an impressive noise as they clattered over the partially fossilised maze of points and crossings. Motorway construction has subsequently transformed this entire area. For example, New City Road is now virtually a cul-de-sac. Cowcaddens. The tracks branching left led into Maitland Street Spur. Only the 29 now tackled the grades on Hope Street, the steepest of which was 1 in 21. The intersection with Sauchiehall Street, Bath Street, and the junction with Bothwell Street. Despite the arrival of buses, Argyle Street remained a tramway stronghold, with the 9s, 15s, 26s and 29s. To cater for demand on the Maryhill Road, numerous short working 29s turning at Glasgow Cross used Moyer Street Loop, opened in 1925. Demand was equally high along Gallowgate, one of two main arteries heading east from Glasgow Cross. Here the 29 shared the tracks with the 15 as far as Park Head. The bridge in the background carries an advert for Croft, who built bus bodies for a time after the war. At Park Head, the 29s continued east towards Toll Cross, the 15s forking left into West Muir Street. A spur still led into the washing machine at Park Head Depot. Beyond Park Head, the 29s continued for a further 2 miles. In Stygian gloom, a train storms up the bank from Park Head Stadium Station. Latterly, much of the track along Toll Cross Road was in poor condition, although this did not prevent outbound drivers notching up in anticipation of snatching a cigarette at the end of the 7.5-mile journey. Until 1912, Toll Cross and Shettleston had been separate from Glasgow. The cars reversed just over the city boundary in the county of Lanark. Trams had once continued eastwards to Broomhouse and Uddingston. On the 47-minute trip from Maryhill, the 29s had crossed the city virtually from boundary to boundary. During the afternoon of the 21st of October, an enthusiast tour was held on board 585, which, although not in public use, was the only serviceable standard available in latter-day livery. Purchased privately, 585 was eventually donated to the Science Museum in London. Covering sections of the 29, it was the last car to use Maitland Street siding, installed as late as 1944. Here it reversed to run back up the Maryhill Road to another siding. Gairbraid Avenue, terminus of the 23 until August 1957. Evocative scenes taken during the late evening of the last day of the 29 on the 21st of October, and as usual, it was raining. St. George's Cross. The last passenger tram in North Glasgow was Coronation 1279, which entered Maryhill Depot in the early hours of Sunday, the 22nd of October. Between November 1960 and mid-October 1961, 73 cars had been scrapped and 50 burnt in the Dalmarnock Depot fire. With the subsequent withdrawal of 1100 for storage at Copler Hill, the fleet consisted entirely of Coronations and Cunadas, together with the former Blue Devil 1005. At the start of the final year, just 3 services remained, all operating via Argyle Street on east-west configurations. About 160 cars were in stock, but many were awaiting disposal at the 2 remaining depots, Dalmarnock and Partick. Although the last complete overhauls and repaints had been scheduled in 1959, and despite the occasional repairs and touch-ups which were still taking place, the bulk of the fleet looked decidedly neglected and travel-weary. Operating from the city to Bayliston, the 15 was replaced by bus 62 as from the 11th of March 1962. This was the 6¼ mile remnant of the former Green service to Airdrie, abandoned in 1956. Also closed was the depot access track along Springfield Road. Since the withdrawal of the 21 in May 1957, this had been the only route terminating in the central area. With its 2 crossovers, the long Anderston Cross siding was just over ½ a mile west of Central Station, close to many of the city's major docks. For the first ½ mile, the 15s ran in tandem with the other 2 surviving services. Breakdowns increased as maintenance standards fell. A hold-up in Argyle Street. Trongate. Note the Albion Tower wagon. However, it was not only the trams which caused disruption. A policeman waits patiently for a Sunbeam trolleybus to be rewired at the busy London Road Salt Market Junction. Since October, the 15 was the only tram service running along Gallowgate with its canyon-like row of tenements. Coverage of the 15 is taken in a variety of different weather conditions. First, reminders of sunnier days with views on the semi-rural section between Shettleston and Bayliston, the last 1½ miles of which lay outside the city boundary. Approaching Garrow Hill. Main Street, Bayliston, first reached by trams in 1906. Since 1957, Bayliston Terminus had been located at Martin Crescent, 36 minutes from Anderston Cross. The winter of 1961-2 proved one of the worst on record. Following a blizzard, a disabled Coronation is hauled back to Dalmarnock Depot. Before the days of gritting, road surfaces were frequently icy and treacherous. Garrow Hill, one of 2 major intermediate termini. Beyond the Glasgow boundary, trams competed with SMT buses. Predominantly the preserve of standards and coronations until the advent of the goddesses, Cunadas had only appeared on the 15 as late as November 1960. A passenger slips on the icy surface. With its heavy peak hour schedule, some cars short work to Shettleston, approximately 4 miles from central Glasgow. Fog now shrouding Shettleston Sheddings, junction with the former 23. Westmuir Street. 28 cars were broken up between October 1961 and mid-March 1962. More now followed, some being stored in the fire-damaged part of Dalmarnock. The 9-mile former Red Service 26 was replaced by Bus 63 as from the 3rd of June. Duplicating the 9 for much of its length, the 26 required about 30 cars in P-cars. Since October 1961, the 26s had terminated just short of the city boundary at Dalmarnock. Only 2/3 of a mile along Dalmarnock Road was actually abandoned. The former triangular junction with Springfield Road. Near the low-level station, a freight train rumbles over Dalmarnock Road on the now dismantled former Caledonian avoiding line. "1318 takes up service. From the 3rd of June, Dalmarnock would be the city's only depot. It had once had a maximum capacity for 119 cars. To provide access, tracks north to Bridgeton Cross would remain operational. At the cross, the 26s join forces with the 9 for the long journey west via London Road and Glasgow Cross. In P-cars, a few cars reversed on the loop at Finniston, especially those returning to Partick Depot. The 26s had the usual large number of intermediate termini, including Partick, White Inch and Yoker, but the most important was Scotstoun. Balmoral Street siding lay a few hundred yards from the Albion Motors factory. At P-cars and on Saturdays, they also continued to Clyde Bank. One car withdrawn as a result of this closure was Blue Devil, the former unidirectional car 1005 of 1947. Rebuilt in 1956 to resemble a Cunarder, it had latterly operated at peak times only from Partick. On the afternoon of the last day, 1089 returned to its old stamping ground for an enthusiast tour. It also travelled into unfamiliar territory. As it was distinguished by having nothing on top, the single-decker was nicknamed by some Wee Baldy. Here it swings through the remains of the complicated three-way junction at Bridgeton Cross en route for Dalmarnock, reversing at Church Street for the last lap to Partick. For its final run into Partick Depot, Cunarder 1318 carried the inscription, "The Last 26." Accompanied by a lone piper, 1270 was the very last tram to arrive at Partick in the early hours of the 3rd of June. Partick was now closed, ready for conversion to a bus garage. In its heyday, it had a maximum capacity for 124 cars. Standards, Kilmarnock, single-deckers for the Duntocka route, Coronations, the Shipyard Specials 1089 and 1100, and Cunarders since January 1959. Former Red Service 9, operating from Auchenshuggle in the east to Dalmuir west, was a classic trunk tram route. At times of peak demand, up to 55 cars were required to handle the constant stream of short-stage passengers, few of whom would ever make the full end-to-end 12-mile journey. Auchenshuggle was probably the most famous of all the Glasgow termini. Some wits have even suggested the name was invented to increase revenue by encouraging inquisitive visitors to discover its whereabouts. In fact, it means field of rye. The crew referred to the route as the Shugal to the west. Inbound cars departing along London Road almost immediately pass the city boundary. Note the long demolished prefabs. Belvedere Hospital. London Road crossover, terminus of the 10 until June 1960 and still used for short workings. Fares had just been increased by a penny on Saturdays only. Celtic Park. Having passed under the ex-Caledonian freight line which skirted the eastern suburbs, the trams entered one of the most densely populated areas of the city. Bridgeton Cross, deep in the heart of the East End, was still a major transfer point, with connections onto rail, bus and trolleybus. Following traditional Glasgow practice, the public were allowed to travel on all trams working to and from any depot. Passing Bridgeton Central Station. Depot workings reversed in Abercrombie Street, once part of the Yellow Peril Service 7. Barrowland Market and the eased-out S-Bend, which connected the former Great Hamilton Street with London Street, later London Road. Outbound under the City of Glasgow Union Railway Bridge linking the Queen Street low-level lines with St Enoch Station and the south side. The London Road end of Moyer Street also remained for short workings. Glasgow Cross at the Salt Market High Street intersection. On the north side, the imposing toll booth steeple dating from 1626, and on the south, the elegant Tron steeple. The Hielanman's Umbrella, the cavernous tunnel under the approaches to Glasgow Central, afforded free shelter for all, including those queuing for the trams. Along Argyle Street, heading west. Anderston Cross. Finniston, terminus of the former shuttle service to Stob Cross Ferry, closed in 1925. Suddenly the trams emerged from the gloom into a wide expanse of greenery, flanked by the Kelvin Hall and the university. Partick Bridge over the River Kelvin marked the eastern boundary of the former borough absorbed in 1912. The entrance to Partick Cross Underground Station. The substation in Ben Alder Street, which had also served the Underground. A blue train arrives at Partick Hill Station across Dumbarton Road from the former depot in Hayburn Street. passing under the twin railway bridges at Partick West. Balshagray School, White Inch, Scotstoun, Scotstoun West, former junction with Service 1. The endless stream of trams along Dumbarton Road ran in close proximity to many of the Clyde shipbuilding yards. From Yoker, a short walk led to the chain-operated Renfrew ferry. Until 1957, passengers had connected on the opposite bank with the 28 trams to Paisley. Here, the paddle steamer Jeannie Deans heads upstream past Yoker Power Station and the ferry. For its final 2.5 miles, the 9 operated in the borough of Clydebank, which uniquely insisted on owning its own tramways in perpetuity, whilst leaving Glasgow to operate them. That agreement, stretching back 60 years, was soon to come to an end. But the town officials, determined to demonstrate their independence to the finish, were planning their own last tram celebration. 20 years on, the number of open spaces gave clear evidence of the damage inflicted on Clydebank by the bombing of March 1941. Passing the UCBS biscuit factory. Clydebank was home to possibly the most famous shipyard in the world. Vessels launched from John Brown's included the Cunard Queens. At shift times, thousands poured through the yard gates. Occasionally, a Fowler's loco would scurry across the road. The Cunarders had taken their unofficial name from the passenger liners built here after the war. The swing bridge, spanning the Forth and Clyde Canal, had only been reopened to traffic in late 1960, following extensive renovation. Protective catch points were provided on either side. The canal was finally closed in December 1962, and this bridge later replaced by a fixed structure. This driver even has time for a bit of fun, despite the 68-minute journey and the 11.73-mile run from Auchenshuggle. Beyond the terminal crossover at Dalmuir West, the track still extended to the substation. With the end now in sight, enthusiasts from all over the world flocked to pay their respects, and several specially chartered trams were run. Most covered the works-only trackage leading from Argyle Street into Hope Street. Thence into St Vincent Street, where 1321 is seen on the 26th of August, turning into Renfield Street, for the run over Jamaica Bridge and out to Copler Hill. On arrival, a visit was made to Barland Street Permanent Way Yard, where the remaining works cars were inspected. Barland Street had once been home to over 20 works cars. By the end, only a handful were operational. The works was also inspected. Some cars had been partially repainted in readiness for the final procession. Standards 22 and 585 were undergoing restoration. The work shunter made occasional forays into Albert Drive. Eventually, stripped of all available parts, 76 went for scrap in December 1962. 60 cars were broken up between April and the end of August. Accident victim 1275, for example, was scrapped on June the 6th. Since June, the bodies have been separated in two and transported by a low loader to a scrapyard in Partick. On several occasions, the cars earmarked for preservation were lined up for photographers on Albert Drive. 672, rescued by the fledgling Scottish Tramway Museum Society, was to be preserved by the corporation. As were standards 779 and 1088. Retained because of its technological innovation, 1089 was a late addition to the collection. Normal tramway operation was scheduled to finish after Saturday night the 1st of September with replacement of the through Auchenshuggle-Dalmuir West service by buses, although trams would continue to operate for 3 more days between Auchenshuggle and Anderston Cross. Many people were experiencing their last ride. Several enthusiast tours were run over the last 2 weekends. 1321 is seen coming off Finniston Loop. Sister car 1360 is manhandled back under the wires, having run to the extremity of the track leading to the substation at Dalmuir West. Earlier 1360, in company with 1222, had explored every inch of the track at Barland Street. Rain, which bedevilled the next 3 days, set in on the Saturday night and probably deterred many people from witnessing the passing of the last regular service trams. 1383, the final car from Dalmuir West, left the terminus at 11:33. 1313, the very last number 9, which had run in from Yoker, entered Dalmarnock Depot at 12:55 a.m. This was the official end of normal tramway operation in the city. However, for the next 3 days, 8 cars shuttled every 8 minutes between Anderston Cross and Auchenshuggle at a flat fare of 6pence. Special tickets being cancelled by bell punches. On Sunday afternoon, the 2nd of September, the final enthusiast tour was held on board 1100, the last maximum traction double-decker in the world and the only car fitted with 2-motor contactor equipment. It covered all available track east of Anderston Cross. Here it reverses in Moyer Street. The special sixpenny service ended at 4:50 on Tuesday the 4th of September when 1174 pulled away from Anderston Cross. It carried a crude headboard. "Goodbye, trams. Thank you for all you've done for us." This was the last passenger tram in Scotland. At 5:32 it reversed at Auchenshuggle. Now followed one of the most memorable occasions in the history of the city. At about 6:30, the final procession left Dalmarnock to be greeted by huge crowds. These recordings were made during the actual procession.
Any regrets about the trams being withdrawn?
Oh, yes.
You think it's really a sad moment for Glasgow?
Because I don't think that anything will ever replace the Glasgow trams.
Very sorry. It was the only thing that people could travel in comfort and could travel in the fog too.
Well, I think they were very dependable, you know, in bad weather and, you know, fog and circumstances like that. You could always depend on them.
Well, it's sort of sad seeing them all going off the road, isn't it?
Yes, and have you any connection with the corporation?
Just a conductress.
Oh, you're a conductress. How very nice indeed. And the lady with you, who is
My
she?
mother. She was a tram driver in 1914.
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm travelling still in the last car.
Yes.
And I remember when the first one went up the Gallowgate.
At Barrowland, the procession was delayed whilst emergency repairs were carried out to the lifeguard of 1392. Glistening in the rain, the cortege finally wound its way slowly but majestically over Jamaica Bridge. Perhaps at last it was clear the end had finally come. That from tomorrow, trams in Glasgow would be gone. But in Clydebank, another less well-publicised farewell was held 2 days later, when, driven by William Trotter, the oldest motorman, 1282 left Clydebank Town Hall bound for Dalmuir West. Here it reversed at 7:20 p.m. to run to Yoker, and then back to Clydebank Town Hall. Gradually, over a period of several nights, the 60 cars still at the depot were transferred to Copler Hill, the last being 1165 on the 15th of September. On September the 8th, Works Car 40, ex-standard 722, made the last full trip over the former 9 in connection with track lifting operations. No film is known of this run. Car scrapping at the yard in Partick continued until February 1963, and gradually those trams set aside for preservation also left the works. To join others such as 812, 1068 and 1115, 22 departed for the Tramway Museum at Cryche in Derbyshire on the 21st of May 1963. 1274 made the longest trip of all to the Seashore Trolley Museum at Kennebunkport in the USA. As the works completed its last trolleybus overhauls, 1274 was made ready for the journey. It left Prince's Dock, Glasgow on September the 12th, 1963, arriving in Boston 10 days later. Last to leave Copler Hill was 1100 on the 4th of February 1964. Since 1987, the collection of trams seen here in Copler Hill has been housed in the new Museum of Transport at Kelvin Hall. For Glasgow, that appeared to be the end of the story, and few seriously believed trams would ever run in the city again. But miracles do occur, and 25 years later in 1988 they did return as part of the International Garden Festival. Included were 3 trams from the Glasgow area on loan from the National Tramway Museum, Standard 22, which had featured in the royal opening of the festival. Ex-Paisley 68 of 1919, superbly restored to original open-top condition. And Cunarder 1297, which had also participated in the Blackpool Tramway Centenary events of 1985. All 3 are now back at Cryche, where they can be seen in company with other representatives of the Glasgow fleet, one of the true giants of the tramway world. To accompany the closing credits, the sounds of a Cunarder on the streets of the city.